Evelyn Carter had spent 9 years keeping a family business alive, while everyone around her acted like success simply happened on its own. Every morning before sunrise, she unlocked the doors of Sweet Harbor Bakery, turned on the lights, checked inventory, answered supplier emails, and balanced the numbers before the first customer even walked in. To the outside world, the bakery belonged to her mother, Linda Carter, a respected woman in town who loved telling people how hard she worked to maintain the family legacy after her husband passed away. But the truth was buried behind warm smiles and polished display shelves. Evelyn was the one carrying everything. She handled the late-night repair calls when ovens broke down. She stayed awake calculating payroll when sales were low. She negotiated with angry suppliers, fixed scheduling disasters, and quietly paid overdue bills before anyone else noticed the business was struggling. Her younger brother Jason never cared about how any of it worked. He only liked the benefits that came with it. Nice dinners, expensive clothes, new gadgets, weekend trips. He talked proudly about our family bakery, while barely knowing how to operate the register. And somehow, no matter how exhausted Evelyn became, nobody ever stopped to ask if she was okay. If stories about family betrayal and silent sacrifice hit close to home, take a second to like and subscribe, because this story only gets more painful from here. The hardest part for Evelyn wasn't the workload, it was the invisibility. Customers praised her mother for the bakery's success. Neighbors admired Jason for helping the business grow. Even relatives spoke, as if Evelyn were just another employee passing through. At family dinners, Linda talked endlessly about Jason's future plans, while Evelyn sat quietly clearing plates after everyone finished eating. Sometimes Evelyn wondered what would happen if she simply disappeared for a week. Would anyone notice? Or would they only notice when something stopped working? Still she stayed. Not because she was weak, but because Sweet Harbor was the last piece of her father left in the world. Before he died, he used to stand beside her in the kitchen, teaching her how to knead dough by hand, telling her that real love meant showing up even when nobody clapped for you. Evelyn held on to those words for years, like a promise carved into her heart. She convinced herself that sacrifice was proof of love, that eventually her family would recognize everything she had done for them. But deep down, a quiet exhaustion had already started growing inside her. Every ignored effort, every sleepless night, every moment she swallowed her own feelings to keep the bakery running, added another crack beneath the surface. And none of them realized the terrifying truth: the entire foundation of Sweet Harbor rested on the shoulders of the one person they appreciated the least. There was one thing more painful than being overworked, and Evelyn Carter was starting to realize it day by day: being surrounded by people who benefited from your sacrifice while pretending it cost you nothing. Sweet Harbor Bakery was thriving on the outside. The glass displays were always full, the tables stayed crowded on weekends, and customers constantly praised the warm atmosphere of the family-owned business. But behind those smiling faces and fresh pastries was a truth nobody wanted to acknowledge. Evelyn was carrying the entire operation alone, while her own family enjoyed the rewards, as if they had earned them equally. Her mother, Linda Carter, loved attention. Every community event became another opportunity to talk about how difficult it was to run a business as a single mother. She accepted compliments, gracefully smiled for photos beside the bakery sign, and listened proudly whenever people called her an inspiration. Evelyn often stood only a few feet away during those conversations, holding supply boxes or cleaning trays, yet somehow she felt invisible every single time. Linda never introduced her as the reason the bakery survived. She simply called her helpful. Jason was even worse. He treated the bakery like a personal bank account. Whenever profits were good, he celebrated by buying expensive shoes, taking weekend trips with friends, or upgrading his electronics. He loved posting photos online with captions about hard work paying off, even though he barely spent a few hours a week at the bakery. The few times he actually showed up, he mostly sat near the register talking to customers, while Evelyn handled everything happening in the back. And the most frustrating part, people believed him. Customers laughed at his jokes, neighbors admired his confidence, and relatives constantly praised him for stepping up for the family. Meanwhile, Evelyn spent nights fixing invoices, reorganizing schedules, and calculating whether the bakery could survive another slow month. Yet nobody praised her resilience because nobody even noticed it. One Sunday evening, the family gathered for dinner at Linda's house after closing the bakery early. Jason spent nearly an hour talking excitedly about a luxury apartment he wanted downtown. Linda listened proudly, asking about the rooftop pool and modern gym, as if the purchase were already guaranteed. Then Jason casually said honestly, with how successful the bakery is getting, this should be easy. Evelyn nearly stopped breathing when she heard that sentence, not because of the money, but because of the assumption behind it. Jason spoke as though the bakery existed to fund his dreams. No hesitation, no gratitude. No understanding of how many nights Evelyn had skipped sleep just to keep the business afloat. Linda turned toward Evelyn and said softly, "We should support him. Family helps family." That sentence settled heavily in Evelyn's chest because deep down she already knew the painful truth. In this family, support only flowed in one direction, toward everyone except her. If you've ever felt invisible while carrying everyone else's burdens, comment number 2 below, because Evelyn's breaking point is getting closer than anyone realizes. Evelyn Carter had spent years convincing herself that being overlooked was normal, but nothing could have prepared her for the silence of that birthday. She woke up before dawn like she always did, tied her apron behind her back, and opened Sweet Harbor Bakery, while the streets outside were still dark and empty. The smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen, ovens hummed softly, and customers began arriving one by one with warm smiles and casual greetings. "Morning, Evelyn. The cinnamon rolls today smell amazing. You always work too hard." Small comments from strangers somehow felt kinder than anything she had heard from her own family in months. Deep down, a tiny part of her still expected something to happen. Maybe her mother would walk in carrying flowers. Maybe Jason would send a quick text. Maybe someone would remember that for once it was supposed to be her day. But hour after hour passed and nothing came. No message, no call, no surprise. Just receipts, orders, coffee stains, and endless work. By late afternoon, Evelyn finally checked her phone during a short break in the storage room. The screen remained painfully empty, except for promotional emails and notifications from delivery apps. Her chest tightened, but she quickly locked the phone again, pretending it didn't hurt as much as it did. That evening, after closing the bakery alone, she drove back to her apartment exhausted. The silence inside the car felt heavier than usual. She kept telling herself not to be emotional, not to expect too much, not to act childish over a birthday. But the harder she tried to dismiss the feeling, the more obvious the truth became. The people she sacrificed everything for had forgotten her completely. Then just before midnight, her phone suddenly lit up. For one brief second, hope rushed back into her chest so quickly it almost hurt. Her mother's name appeared on the screen. Evelyn smiled instinctively before opening the message. But the moment she saw the photo attached, her smile disappeared. Linda and Jason were sitting together inside an expensive rooftop restaurant, laughing beside a giant chocolate cake decorated with golden candles. Jason stood proudly next to a brand new luxury car parked behind the table. The caption read, "Celebrating Jason's new beginning. So proud of you." Evelyn stared at the screen in silence. Her birthday had been forgotten, but somehow there had still been time for a celebration. A real one. One planned carefully with reservations, photos, expensive food, and attention. And the worst part wasn't even the post itself. It was realizing that nobody in that restaurant had paused for even 1 second to remember her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the family group chat and typed a single sentence. "Today was my birthday." She stared at the message for several seconds before pressing send. Almost immediately, 2 read receipts appeared beneath it. Linda had seen it. Jason had seen it. But neither of them replied. Minutes passed in silence so heavy it almost felt cruel. If this story breaks your heart even a little, don't forget to like and subscribe, because what Evelyn discovers next will completely change the way she sees her family forever. Evelyn Carter thought being forgotten on her birthday was the worst feeling possible. But she was about to learn something even more painful. Sometimes the people closest to you don't just ignore your feelings, they make you feel guilty for having them in the first place. She sat alone in her apartment, staring at the family group chat, watching the tiny scene notification under her message. Today was my birthday. Such a small sentence. No anger, no accusation. Just a quiet reminder that she existed. For a moment Evelyn still believed there would be some kind of explanation. Maybe her mother would apologize. Maybe Jason would realize how hurtful all of this looked. Maybe they would suddenly understand how lonely she felt after spending years sacrificing herself for everyone else. But instead her phone buzzed again. A new message from Linda appeared almost instantly. Everything doesn't have to be about you, Evelyn. Evelyn read the sentence once. Then again, slower this time. Her stomach tightened as if the air had suddenly disappeared from the room. That one sentence hurt more than being forgotten, because it transformed her pain into selfishness. Somehow, after working herself to exhaustion for the bakery, after giving up weekends, relationships, rest, and most of her adult life to keep the family business alive, she was now being treated like a burden, simply for wanting to be remembered, on her own birthday. Before she could even process the message completely, another notification appeared underneath it. Jason had reacted with a laughing emoji. Not concern, not guilt. Laughter. Evelyn stared at the screen in silence while something inside her quietly cracked apart. The room around her suddenly felt colder. She thought back to every moment she had defended her family to friends who warned her she was giving too much. Every holiday she spent working while others celebrated. Every excuse she made for Linda's coldness or Jason's selfishness. She had convinced herself for years that family love simply looked different in their house. But at that moment, sitting alone under the dim kitchen light, with tears finally gathering in her eyes, she realized something terrifying. This wasn't love being expressed badly. This was emotional neglect, disguised as family loyalty. The worst part was how normal they made it seem. Linda probably sent that message without even thinking twice. Jason probably laughed and moved on with his night seconds later. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat frozen, replaying those words over and over in her head, like they were carving themselves into her memory. Everything doesn't have to be about you. But for nearly a decade, everything had been about them. Their comfort, their dreams, their reputation, their happiness. Evelyn had simply disappeared into the background to make all of it possible. And now, for the first time, she was beginning to see the imbalance clearly. Not because someone explained it to her, but because pain finally forced her to stop lying to herself. She slowly locked her phone and placed it face down on the kitchen counter. No reply. No argument. No emotional outburst. Just silence. But beneath that silence, something important had started changing. The version of Evelyn who kept accepting crumbs of affection was beginning to disappear. And the next decision she makes will shake that entire family apart. If you were in Evelyn's position hearing those words from your own family, what would you do? Share your honest opinion in the comments, because this moment changes everything from here on. The most dangerous moment in a toxic family is not the screaming, the insults, or even the betrayal. It is the quiet second when the person who has suffered the most finally stops begging to be loved. That was the moment Evelyn Carter reached the morning after her birthday. She woke up exhausted, not because she had cried all night, but because something inside her had finally broken beyond repair. The apartment was silent except for the sound of rain tapping softly against the windows. Her phone rested face down on the kitchen counter, exactly where she had left it, after reading her mother's cruel message and Jason's laughing reaction. For years, Evelyn had always been the first one to fix things, the first to apologize after arguments she didn't start, the first to work harder whenever the bakery struggled, the first to sacrifice sleep, money, and happiness just to keep everyone else comfortable. But that morning felt different. For the first time in nearly a decade, she felt emotionally empty instead of guilty. She made coffee, slowly staring at the steam rising from the mug, while memories replayed endlessly in her mind. Her father teaching her recipes after school, the promise she made to protect Sweet Harbor after he died. All the nights, she stayed alone at the bakery while Linda and Jason enjoyed their lives without ever asking what those sacrifices cost her. Then her eyes drifted toward the office folder sitting near the table. Inside were payroll records, supplier contracts, bank access forms, inventory schedules, passwords, and every operational detail required to keep Sweet Harbor running. Evelyn suddenly realized something terrifying. Her family had no idea how much she actually controlled. Linda believed the bakery functioned naturally because it always had. Jason assumed money simply appeared because it always did. Neither of them understood that behind every successful day at Sweet Harbor was Evelyn quietly solving problems before anyone else even noticed them. And for the first time, Evelyn asked herself a question she had avoided for years. What would happen if she stopped? Not out of revenge, not out of cruelty, but simply because she no longer had the strength to keep carrying people who didn't care whether she collapsed. Her breathing slowed as the answer became painfully clear. The bakery would fall apart without her. Slowly at first, then all at once. The realization didn't make her feel powerful. It made her feel sad, because she understood that the only reason she had remained valuable to her family was because of what she provided, not who she was. Evelyn closed her eyes for a long moment before finally opening her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard while her heart pounded heavily in her chest. One email, that was all it would take. No dramatic speech. No emotional confrontation. Just a simple decision. She began typing calmly. Effective immediately, I will no longer be responsible for the daily operations, financial management, scheduling, vendor communication, or administrative duties related to Sweet Harbor Bakery. Please direct all future responsibilities elsewhere. Evelyn read the message twice. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. From grief. Because deep down she knew she wasn't only walking away from a bakery. She was walking away from years of emotional survival, built on the hope that one day her family would finally choose her too. Then, without allowing herself another second to hesitate, Evelyn pressed send. For years, Linda and Jason believed Sweet Harbor Bakery ran smoothly, because success had simply become part of their lives. They never questioned the stocked shelves, the paid invoices, the organized schedules, or the steady stream of customers filling the cafe every morning. To them, the business worked the same way electricity worked. You flipped a switch, and everything appeared. What they never understood was that Evelyn Carter had been the invisible engine behind every single moving piece, and the moment she stepped away, the illusion began collapsing, faster than either of them could imagine. The first signs appeared within 48 hours. A supplier called demanding payment for overdue dairy invoices that Evelyn had always handled before anyone noticed there was a problem. Linda confidently assured the man she would look into it, only to realize she had no idea which account the payments even came from. The next morning, 2 employees failed to show up because payroll had not been processed correctly. Jason tried calming customers at the front counter, while Linda panicked in the office, surrounded by papers she didn't understand. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat quietly inside a small coffee shop across town, staring out the window as rain slid slowly down the glass. Her phone buzzed non-stop in her bag, but she refused to look at it. Part of her expected to feel satisfaction watching the bakery struggle without her. Instead, she mostly felt numb. Years of stress had trained her to respond instantly whenever something went wrong at Sweet Harbor. Every ringing phone call triggered instinctive anxiety in her chest, but this time she forced herself to stay seated. By the 4th day, the problems multiplied. An important wedding order had been prepared incorrectly. Because nobody knew, Evelyn kept separate allergy instructions hidden inside the scheduling software. The furious bride demanded a refund online, and within hours, negative reviews began spreading across social media. Linda tried blaming the staff, but employees were already whispering among themselves about how much Evelyn used to handle alone. Jason attempted taking control, but his confidence disappeared the moment real decisions became necessary. He couldn't negotiate supplier contracts. He didn't know inventory numbers. He had never even learned how the bakery's accounting system worked. Everything he once treated like a family privilege suddenly became overwhelming responsibility. And for the first time, Linda began realizing something she never wanted to admit out loud. Sweet Harbor had not survived because of family unity. It survived because Evelyn sacrificed herself silently every single day. On the 6th morning after Evelyn's resignation, the bakery opened nearly 2 hours late, because nobody had ordered ingredients for the weekend rush. Customers stood outside confused, while employees argued inside about missing deliveries. Jason snapped angrily at a cashier in front of customers. Linda locked herself in the office, crying, after the bank called about irregular transactions and unpaid vendor balances. The warm, welcoming atmosphere Sweet Harbor was famous for had completely disappeared. In less than a week, the business was unraveling publicly. Yet the most painful part for Evelyn was realizing how quickly everyone suddenly noticed her absence, only after her labor disappeared. Nobody had cared when she was emotionally exhausted. Nobody noticed when she stopped sleeping properly or eating on time. But the moment profit schedules and operations began failing, she became impossible to ignore. Sitting alone in the coffee shop, Evelyn finally understood a truth she had avoided for years. Some people never appreciate your presence. They only panic when they lose access to what you were giving them. The moment Sweet Harbor Bakery started collapsing, Linda and Jason finally remembered Evelyn Carter existed. Not because they missed her, not because they loved her, but because for the first time in years, they were being forced to survive without the person who had quietly protected them from every consequence. Evelyn noticed it immediately, in the way the phone calls started. At first, there were only a few missed calls from Linda appearing late at night. Then came the text messages. "Call me back. This situation is getting serious. We need to talk." None of them asked how she was doing. None of them mentioned the birthday they forgot, or the cruel words that pushed her away. Every message focused only on the bakery. The business. The money. The problems. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, reading them one after another while a strange calm settled inside her chest. Weeks earlier, these messages would have sent her into panic mode instantly. She would have rushed back to Sweet Harbor without hesitation, fixing schedules, calming suppliers, apologizing to employees, and carrying the stress alone until everything stabilized again. But now, something had changed. For the first time, she could see the pattern clearly. Her value to her family had always depended on how useful she was. On the third day of non-stop calls, Jason finally left a voicemail. His voice sounded irritated instead of concerned. "Evelyn, this is getting ridiculous. Staff are quitting, customers are angry, and mom's stressed out all the time. You can't just walk away because your feelings got hurt." Evelyn replayed the message twice in disbelief. Not once did he acknowledge the years she sacrificed for them. Not once did he apologize. In Jason's mind, her emotional exhaustion was merely an inconvenience, interfering with his comfortable life. That realization hurt more than she expected. Later that evening, Linda called again. This time, Evelyn answered after staring at the screen for nearly a minute. The second the call connected, her mother started speaking rapidly. "The bakery account is frozen because payments were missed. Vendors are threatening legal action. Employees are demanding answers. You need to come back tomorrow. No hello, no concern, no, are you okay?" Evelyn listened silently, while her mother continued talking as if giving orders to an employee instead of speaking to her daughter. Then Linda finally said the sentence that changed everything. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. For years, that kind of guilt would have worked instantly. She would have blamed herself, apologized, and rushed back to fix the damage. But now, sitting alone in the quiet apartment, she finally understood how manipulative those words truly were. Linda wasn't asking her to come back because she missed her daughter. She wanted her unpaid labor back. Evelyn took a slow breath before responding calmly. "I gave that bakery almost my entire life. And none of you noticed until things stopped working." Silence filled the phone. Heavy, uncomfortable, real. Linda sounded shocked, almost offended that Evelyn had finally spoken honestly. Then came anger. "So you're really abandoning your family?" Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, as tears burned behind them. Because even now, her mother still refused to understand. Setting boundaries was treated like betrayal. Choosing herself was treated like cruelty. Before ending the call, Evelyn quietly said, "I was already abandoned a long time ago. You just didn't notice because I kept showing up anyway." Then she hung up, and for the first time in years, the silence afterward felt peaceful instead of lonely. If this story resonates with you, subscribing to the channel helps more stories like Evelyn's reach people who may need to hear them most. Sometimes the most heartbreaking realization in life is discovering that people never truly loved you for who you were. They loved the comfort, stability, and sacrifices you provided, and the moment those things disappear, their affection disappears too. That truth hit Evelyn Carter, slowly like cold rain, soaking through clothing one layer at a time. Days had passed since she walked away from Sweet Harbor Bakery, and the chaos behind her continued growing louder. Suppliers were threatening lawsuits, online reviews kept getting worse. Employees were quitting, and Linda's desperate phone calls had turned into angry accusations. But through all of it, one detail haunted Evelyn more than anything else. Nobody missed her as a person. They only missed what she used to do for them. One afternoon, Evelyn sat alone on a bench near the waterfront after leaving a small bookstore downtown. The air smelled like salt and rain, and gray clouds drifted heavily above the harbor. Her phone buzzed again in her coat pocket. Another message from Jason. She stared at the screen for several seconds before finally opening it. "Mom's crying every day. I hope you're happy." That was it. No apology. No concern for her emotional state. No acknowledgement of the years she carried the entire family on her back. Just another attempt to make her feel responsible for everyone else's suffering while ignoring her own completely. Evelyn locked the screen and stared out toward the dark water. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to ask a question she had avoided for years because the answer terrified her. If she had stopped giving everything to her family sooner, would they have still wanted her around at all? The silence inside her mind felt louder than the crashing waves nearby, because deep down, she already knew the answer. She began replaying old memories differently now. Family dinners where Linda only praised Jason's accomplishments. Holidays where Evelyn cooked, cleaned, and organized everything while everyone else relaxed. Conversations that always centered around what Evelyn could solve, fix, or provide next. Suddenly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Love in that house had always been conditional. The more she sacrificed, the more valuable she became. The moment she stopped sacrificing, she became selfish, dramatic, and cruel in their eyes. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes, but not because she still hoped they would change. She cried because she finally understood how lonely she had been for so many years without even admitting it to herself. She had spent so much time trying to earn love from people who only measured her worth through usefulness that she forgot she deserved care too. Real care. The kind that asks if you've eaten. The kind that notices when you're exhausted. The kind that remembers your birthday without needing a reminder. A cold wind brushed across the harbor as Evelyn wrapped her coat tighter around herself. For the first time in a very long time, she stopped defending her family in her own mind. She stopped making excuses for Linda's manipulation and Jason's selfishness. And strangely, that honesty felt painful but freeing at the same time. Because once illusions break, you can finally see people clearly. Evelyn slowly stood from the bench, wiped her eyes, and took a deep breath. She didn't know exactly what her future looked like yet, but one thing had become painfully certain. She could no longer return to a life where love only existed when she was useful. If you've ever experienced a relationship where you felt appreciated only for what you gave, instead of who you were, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes hearing another person's story reminds us we're not as alone as we once believed. Sometimes healing does not begin with forgiveness, closure, or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it begins the first morning you wake up and realize nobody is demanding pieces of you anymore. That was the strange feeling Evelyn Carter experienced a few weeks after leaving Sweet Harbor Bakery behind. The silence in her life no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. For years, every hour of her day had belonged to someone else. Customers needed her. Employees depended on her. Linda expected her obedience. Jason expected her sacrifices. But now, for the first time in nearly a decade, Evelyn sat alone at a small kitchen table drinking coffee, while sunlight quietly filled the apartment, and nobody was asking her to save them. The feeling was unfamiliar enough to make her emotional. She still carried guilt sometimes. Late at night, she wondered whether leaving had truly been the right decision. She worried about the bakery employees she cared about. She even worried about Linda despite everything that had happened. But every time doubt crept back into her mind, she remembered the silence on her birthday. The mocking laugh reaction from Jason. The endless phone calls demanding her labor without ever acknowledging her pain. And slowly she stopped confusing guilt with responsibility. One rainy afternoon, Evelyn walked through a quiet neighborhood near the edge of the city and noticed a tiny empty storefront with a faded blue sign hanging above the window. The space was small, barely enough room for a counter, a coffee machine, and a few tables. Most people probably would have ignored it completely. But when Evelyn looked through the dusty glass, something inside her stirred for the first time in months. Not fear. Not pressure. Hope. The next week she signed the lease. She named the little bakery Blue Ember, because it reminded her of something small that survives even after a fire destroys everything around it. Unlike Sweet Harbor, this place belonged entirely to her. No family expectations. No emotional debt. No constant pressure to disappear for someone else's comfort. Evelyn painted the walls herself, assembled secondhand furniture late into the night, and tested recipes in the tiny kitchen until her hands smelled permanently of vanilla and cinnamon again. It was exhausting, but this time, the exhaustion felt different. It no longer came from being used. It came from building something that finally reflected her own heart. On opening day, Evelyn expected almost nobody to show up. Her hands shook nervously while arranging pastries in the display case that morning. Then the front door opened softly, and Hannah walked in carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers and a handwritten card. Hannah had been Evelyn's closest friend years ago before life became consumed by Sweet Harbor. They had slowly lost contact while Evelyn drowned herself in work and family obligations. Without saying much, Hannah placed the flowers on the counter and smiled warmly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Those 4 words nearly broke Evelyn apart. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were sincere. No manipulation hidden beneath them. No expectations attached. Just genuine care. Throughout the afternoon, more customers slowly wandered into Blue Ember. Some complimented the pastries. Others simply enjoyed the cozy atmosphere and soft music playing near the windows. For the first time in years, Evelyn noticed herself smiling naturally, instead of forcing politeness out of exhaustion. Standing behind the counter in her tiny bakery, she suddenly realized something powerful. She had spent so many years surviving that she forgot life was also supposed to feel safe sometimes. And maybe starting over wasn't the end of her story after all. Maybe it was finally the beginning. The hardest part about healing from emotional neglect is realizing that closure does not always come from the people who hurt you. Sometimes closure comes from finally becoming the person you needed during your darkest moments. Nearly a year after leaving Sweet Harbor, Bakery Evelyn Carter stood inside Blue Ember, watching the soft morning light spill across the wooden floors. While customers laughed quietly over coffee and pastries, the little bakery had grown slowly but steadily. Nothing about it was luxurious. The tables were mismatched, the kitchen was tiny, and some mornings Evelyn still arrived before sunrise, exhausted from baking through the night. But for the first time in her adult life, the exhaustion no longer felt connected to pain. It felt connected to purpose. People inside Blue Ember knew her name because they genuinely cared about her, not because they needed something from her. Regular customers asked whether she had eaten lunch. Employees thanked her for staying late to help clean. Some evenings after closing the bakery, Evelyn would sit alone by the window, holding a warm cup of tea, and feel something she once thought was impossible. Safety. Real emotional safety. Then one rainy afternoon, the front door opened unexpectedly, and the entire room seemed to freeze for a second when Linda Carter stepped inside. Evelyn's hands stopped moving instantly behind the counter. Her mother looked different somehow. Smaller, tired. The confident energy she once carried so proudly had faded beneath visible stress and regret. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Customers quietly glanced between them, before returning awkwardly to their drinks. Linda finally stepped closer to the counter and looked around the bakery slowly. "So this is what you built," she said softly. Evelyn nodded once, but remained silent. Linda's eyes drifted toward the shelves filled with fresh pastries and handwritten menu boards hanging beside the kitchen doorway. Then almost painfully she whispered, "Sweet Harbor closed last month." Evelyn felt the words settle heavily inside her chest. Even though she had expected it, eventually hearing it out loud still hurt. Not because she regretted leaving, but because part of her still mourned the dream she once tried so desperately to protect. Linda looked down at her hands before speaking again. "I didn't understand how much you were carrying." Evelyn almost laughed at how simple the sentence sounded compared to the years of damage behind it. But strangely, she no longer felt the same anger burning inside her. Time and distance had changed something important. She no longer needed her mother to fully understand in order to move forward. Linda's voice trembled slightly. "I should have protected you better." Tears filled Evelyn's eyes immediately, because those were the words she had waited years to hear. Not excuses, not guilt, accountability, real accountability. Neither of them spoke for several seconds after that. The sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the silence between them. Finally, Evelyn took a slow breath and quietly said, "I spent so long trying to earn love from people who were supposed to give it freely." Linda lowered her head as tears rolled down her face. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no instant repair for everything broken between them. Some wounds heal slowly. Some relationships never fully return to what they once were. But for the first time, honesty existed between them, instead of denial. And sometimes, that is where healing truly begins. As Linda prepared to leave, she paused near the door and looked back one final time. "Your father would have been proud of you," she whispered. After the door closed behind her, Evelyn stood silently inside Blue Ember while emotion tightened painfully in her chest. But this time the tears falling down her face were not caused by abandonment. They came from finally understanding something beautiful after years of suffering. She had survived people who only loved her when she was useful, and somehow, despite everything, she still found the courage to build a life where she was loved simply for being herself.